SUERF, the European Money and Finance Forum, bringing together policymakers, finance, and academia.
Welcome to the SUERF BAFFi Bocconi webinar on completing a genuine economic and monetary union. In his book, Completing a Genuine Economic and Monetary Union, published by Cambridge University Press in January 2023, Professor Iain Begg from the LSE examines efforts to strengthen economic and monetary union in the European Union, especially over the last decade. Iain asks whether enough has been done to render EMU more sustainable and resilient. Drawing on a survey of 111 leading experts on the economics and politics of EMU, Iain reviews the wide-ranging reforms undertaken since the crisis of the early 2010s and assesses whether they go far enough. Although Iain concludes that much has been done to push the euro towards being a more complete currency, he identifies remaining flaws and challenges which EU leaders need to resolve. We are very honored and pleased to have you with us today, dear Iain. After Iain's presentation, four top experts closely familiar with the workings of the EU, its economic governance, and ongoing endeavors to develop it further will add their perspectives. Jean-Pierre Vidal, Chief Economic Advisor to European Council President Charles Michel at the Council of the European Union and member of SUERF's Council of Management, will start off the panel with a big picture political perspective. Then Isabel Vansteenkiste, Director General at the ECB, and member of SUERF's Council of Management, will offer a central bank perspective. Martin Larch, head of Secretariat of the European Fiscal Board, will bring in a fiscal expert's perspective. The first round of the panel will end with Nicola Giammarioli, Secretary General and Management Board member at the European Stability Mechanism. My name is Ernest Gnan. I'm Secretary General of SUERF. Now, without further ado, may I hand over to Iain Begg.
Thank you very much, Ernest. I'm grateful to you and to your colleague at SUERF for organising this, and I'm especially flattered by the very distinguished panel you've asked to comment on my little effort to understand the EMU. A quick word on the process of producing this book. It took far longer than it should have done because of difficulties with the publisher. The survey you referred to was conducted in the late summer and autumn of 2020, and it had the great risk of being out of date by the time it was published. It was also a little matter during the course of producing the book of things changing very rapidly. In the summer of 2021, when I submitted the book, everybody was worried about inflation being too low. That looked very strange from today's perspective. We hadn't even thought of the Ukraine crisis. We thought we were just about emerging from COVID. So it's been an unusual journey doing this book. Let me move on to why I have in the title Completing and Genuine. Well, the answer is straightforward. In 2012, there was something called the Four Presidents Report, which referred to the ambition to achieve a genuine economic and monetary union. And yes, that's more than a decade ago. It was followed by the Five Presidents Report of 2015, which referred to completing genuine economic and monetary union. So with great imagination, I put the two adjectives together. Each covered the same four dimensions, which you can see here on the screen. The financial integration, financial framework is essentially about creating banking union. Budgetary framework is maybe something to do with fiscal union. It's less clear what the integrated economic policy framework is, although you can say that things like the European semester and attempts to complete the single European market, etc., are part of integrating economic policy. And there was a fourth dimension, which you can regard as a step towards political union, namely democratic legitimacy and accountability. And what you note about all of these is they do significantly deepen European integration in general, and economic and monetary union specifically. But what we also saw that was between 2012 and 2015, the proposals were rather watered down. Let me therefore try to give my snapshot of what is and is not complete and where it might go in the next decade. Let's start with membership. 30 years on from euro being decided upon, and a good 23 years, if you count 1999 as a starting point, we still do not have a complete membership. As we know, Croatia joined earlier this year, and that takes us to 2027. One of the biggest objectors to EMU, UK, yes, hello everybody from the UK, has left. It still leaves 7 significant member states not part of it, and it's difficult to speculate on how many might join over the rest of this decade. Another 2, another 3. Sweden unlikely. As things stand, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary also quite unlikely, and I leave you to speculate on the remainder. The ECB, quite clearly over the period of crisis since the sovereign debt crisis erupted in 2007, has greatly extended what it does. It's no longer dedicated exclusively to price stability. And it may be that, to steal a phrase from Alan Blinder, by 2030 it may become a, quote, more normal central bank. Banking union, big step, single supervisory mechanism, a single resolution mechanism, but common deposit insurance creates difficulties. It may be that over the rest of this decade we'll see a move to provide not full deposit insurance in a common manner, but maybe reinsurance and possibly a backstop. Fiscal union, we've seen a number of developments. European Stability Mechanism, following the 2 temporary mechanisms, was a major step. Next generation EU is a temporary one. But what it also reveals is a significant resistance to creating any new additional fiscal capacity, be it at EU or Eurozone level. It may be that we will see successors to next generation EU by 2030, but on a relatively moderate level, and certainly nothing like what you'd see elsewhere in federalized entities or even unitary states. Internationalization of the euro seemed to start well, reaching around 20% of global reserves, but less evidence for other things, and it seemed to stop. What you also detect about it is that there are differing views, even doubts about whether internationalization in and of itself is a good idea. So I'm skeptical we'll see much change in this over the next few years. Coordination mechanisms represent various forms of other governance, but it's an open question whether they really lead us towards genuine coordination, and whether the impact of those sorts of things, particularly in the fiscal area, has been successful. We all know the Stability and Growth Pact is or has been the centerpiece of EU coordination. We've seen a whole variety of other mechanisms. What I suspect we're heading for is customized rules rather than common rules. Then, on the last dossier, the legitimation and accountability, let's be blunt, it's hard to detect much progress, or really to see any genuine prospect of it changing rapidly. So that's a rather mixed bilan or balance sheet of how things have been going. Allow me here to quote what someone you are all very familiar with, Otmar Issing, said in response to my survey, and I'll read this out in full. EMU has reached a point at which a fundamental decision must be taken. Should EMU be deepened, expanded into fully fledged fiscal and finally political union? If the answer is yes, a fully transparent process of a change of the treaty must be started. I am convinced it would be dangerous to hide political ambitions via democratically not legitimized actions of de facto transfer of national fiscal sovereignty to the European level. Otmar is a wise man. Whether his wisdom is correct in this case, again, we can take up in the discussion. Another concern about the way EMU has evolved is that there's a lot of discipline, rules, etc. But the big question is, do they work? And I'd say that implementation has in many respects been the Achilles heel of the attempts to govern the EMU, even the EU, effectively. We all recall what happened in 2002, 2003, when France and Germany were caught with deficits in excess of 3% of GDP, very moderately in excess in those days, but they were, broadly speaking, let off by the council, which decided that they would not particularly pursue them, and certainly not in the direction of sanctions. And this created something of a signal to others. If France and Germany don't need to make an effort, neither do you. We saw it again in the summer of 2016 in the very curious episode of Spain and Portugal both being told they had excessive deficits, but being fined €0. Open question, is a fine of zero a fine at all? So I think what this tells us is that there's a problem about whether you can make countries comply, exert discipline in the way you'd want. We see this in the various variables pre-COVID already, where there wasn't all that much reduction in the headline deficits. Certainly debts remained above the 60% threshold, which we'd all been told to believe in. And it may well be that this is less an impact of rules, or maybe rules had a effect like a speed limit on the Autobahn of slowing deficits down rather than bringing them under the speed limit. But it may also be that in the pre-COVID era, we had a relatively favorable cyclical conjuncture. And it's an open question whether the more intensive scrutiny of public budgets prior to their implementation, done every autumn by the Commission, has significantly changed what they do once they implement their budgets. And last on this, one of the new inventions in 2011 was something called the macroeconomic imbalances procedure. It'd be very hard to say that that had a striking effect so far. So on then to some of the tensions that all this engenders. One of the big ones is whether there can be a move towards having some new EU or more likely Eurozone fiscal capacity. And this creates three different considerations. One is you'd expect it to have a genuine cross-border impact, to create what so many in the more fiscally disciplined countries have been very uneasy about, the idea of a transfer union. The second is that there is a need, a pressing need, that has been identified in many of the countries, particularly of Southern Europe, for public investment now, supportive investment to enable them to change. Next Generation EU is to some extent taking them in that direction. And it may well be the litmus test for Next Generation EU to see whether this is effective. But at the same time, you continue to see the expression of worries from the many net contributors who are concerned that if you continue to provide support to the Southern European countries in particular, it creates moral hazard. It leads them into bad behavior and fiscal profligacy. And underlying all of this is that the public investment priorities that we see in the EU, the green and the digital, very worthy in their own right, are not the same as the kind of fiscal stabilization packages you saw in the US, or even in what we now get focused on, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, with all the subsidies it proposes to provide for US success in these coming areas. So again, open questions there about tensions. And this leads me on to talk about some of the challenges that we have to face with fiscal governance. I argue, partly based on what's discussed in the book, that we're now facing a rather stark choice. Should we move to a renewed version of the kind of top-down framework that we've been used to, with its rules, with its disciplining procedures, notwithstanding what I would regard as a less than successful record over the last 30 years? Or is it time to say radical change? Let's move to national ownership. But then you face the concern that there is a concern potentially about spillover. If one country does the wrong things, does that create problems for others? And that is perhaps posed as a choice. Do we trust or are we apprehensive? Trust has been something distinctly lacking at EU level and certainly Eurozone level. There's then a question about, in the fiscal governance, what is the appropriate role of the EU and particularly of the Commission? It's certainly important that it's an advisor that provides models and analysis, all these things that we've grown accustomed to. But one of the things to emerge from the discussion about the new proposals from the Commission dating from last November is whether its judicial function, in which it is both the prosecutor and the imposer of fines, is something that is going to be helpful. I know someone will say, strictly speaking, it's the council which imposes fines, but it's on a commission proposal. And then there's a further open question about, and here I'll be interested to hear what Martin Larch has to say, whether the European Fiscal Council should go beyond what I would regard as primarily a commenting role to one which is much more proactive, something which takes away the function from the Commission, but provides more powerful benchmarks and even obligations for the member states. You see my question here, is this a potential solution? Something that many commentators have argued for, notably Charles Wiplosch, or is it a false prospectus? Again, no easy answers. Our next generation EU, I'm sure many of you will recognize the symbol on the left here, very distinguished founding father of the US, Alexander Hamilton. So is this Hamiltonian moment what's been decided with next generation EU? Well, in a very strict sense, no, because the Hamiltonian moment from 1790 was to consolidate the debts of the states into the debts of the United States federal level. That clearly was not what next generation EU did. What it did, however, was to introduce borrowing to finance EU policies. So in that sense, no, it's not a Hamiltonian moment. But to use a different metaphor, I believe we have crossed Rubicon. And so long as next generation EU, or more narrowly the Recovery and Resilience Facility, achieves satisfactory results, I think there'll be great pressure for it to become something permanent. Certainly those I consulted for the book were pretty adamant, with only something like 90+% saying yes, it would not be temporary. There are difficult debates around it. How much conditionality do you impose? It certainly generates cross-border transfers with the conditions that are applied to them. It creates a new tension in fiscal policy, which is it will have to be refunded by future EU taxes. And this creates the problem that if you need to add to existing EU-owned resources, or it will crowd out the existing EU budget. And that is something that a number of member states would find uncomfortable in either way. So this, in turn, leads us back to legitimation issues. How legitimate is it for the EU to be levelling new taxes or looking for new sources of own resources? And then there are going to be huge demands for successor programs to next generation EU, just to name a few: Ukraine, climate transition, and the sovereignty fund proposed by the Commission, and particularly by Ursula von der Leyen. So all these things are around the politics of next generation EU. How then might we arrive at a complete or truly genuine economic and monetary union? Well, there's a number of things we know about. We know we need to take lessons from what's happened over the previous decade and more of crises, work out what went wrong, work out what is needed to redress those wrongs. There is ample unfinished business from both the 4 and 5 presidents' reports, so we already have the roadmap. There is an obligation to ensure that things work well, that if we're transforming governance, we do it in a manner which is effective. But there's also this vexed question of monitoring, compliance. How do you instill ownership in a way that is going to make things work better than in the past? All these are part of it. Now, Martin Wolf, many of you will know, is a highly distinguished economist. And here again, a quote from him: the biggest reason for optimism about, he's talking about the euro survival, must be the consequences of the alternative. Breaking up would be hugely traumatic, financially and economically, and it would also threaten the survival of the EU itself. And those of you that have leafed through the book will find an even more dramatic quote from Joe Stiglitz in his condemnation of what's going on with the euro. So let's pose the question: is it now time to make major advances? And how might that happen? Well, we know there's the exit from succession of crisis. We know we will need at some point to undo the general escape clause. We know there is the problem that in a benign economy, it's far harder to fix things. But the story is, this always told is, you should fix the roof when the sun is shining. And yet the temptation of many politicians is to say, if the sun is shining, let's hold a party. Let's increase public spending. So this is the paradox of when things are going well, it's very difficult to make changes. And yet that's the best time to be making changes. Not least because it's very often the case that if there's a crisis, the response is a rushed one, it's an ad hoc one, it doesn't meet all the conditions that you'd want it to fulfill. Sometimes the instinct, particularly in the Commission, has been to refine, to recalibrate, and it's very difficult to come up with radical changes. Countless changes to the semester process, for example. If you look at the fiscal rules, what you saw was change in after the 2002-2003 crisis, another change in 2011 with the recasting of the Stability and Growth Pact, making debt more of an issue. And it took until last November, after a very prolonged consultation, to come up with something different. And then we also have, even in that something different from the Commission, this strange attachment to the figures of 3% and 60%, referring to the deficit as a proportion of GDP and the debt as a proportion of GDP, which, true, they're in the treaty, or at least in the protocols to the treaty, but what's their economic logic in these days? So, to give plenty of time for discussion, allow me to give you two sets of concluding comments. First is an obvious one. It's not just in membership, but a number of other features that the EU remains incomplete. It's also evident to me, having looked at this for quite some time, that particularly in the periods of crisis, there was too much reliance on the ECB or on monetary policy to come to the rescue and to be asked to do too much. Whatever it takes is a lovely slogan, but sometimes monetary policy gets overstretched. On rules, fiscal rules, did they work or didn't they work? Well, they can help. I would argue that they're least effective in the sort of abnormal times we've been living through for quite some time now. For instance, this acronym ZLB, the zero lower bound, when interest rates can do no more, and you have to resort to unconventional monetary policies. Sometimes compliance is inappropriate. And the concern here is that if it's inappropriate, what you find is that the economics and the rules are in conflict, and you get obsessed with the process and neglect the content, the economic content in particular. You would expect me to say this next. The political economy ought to be taken far more seriously in all of this. France and Germany disagreed at the outset of the euro. They still disagree. So in my best French, plus ça change. So we have concerns here about the way the politics of this are evolving. My second set of comments, the new fiscal governance framework put forward by the Commission. Again, I would say, look at the economics behind it. Are they being driven in the correct direction? What are the aims of this approach? And then also, even though the ideas are received a cautious welcome from many quarters of saying that it's better to customize the rules to make the debt sustainability analyses appropriate for individual countries, you do need nevertheless to work out what the institutional context is going to be. I agree, and this is based not least on some further work I've been doing over the last few months on fiscal frameworks, that fiscal councils do play an important role. But if you look across the EU, they differ markedly in their mandates and their capacity to act. We see differences on what should happen next, and moreover, how rapidly a reform should take place, even though you can say there are many broad directions that are agreed on: banking union, capital markets union, what functions the ECB should perform in future. There's much agreement on all these, but when? When should deposit insurance come in? How rapidly should capital markets union be completed? Should the ECB have roles in things like climate change, or should it stick to its much more treaty-based narrow mandate of price stability plus a little bit on financial stability. We need to think pretty hard about the fiscal framework, because I would argue that fiscal discipline, yes, it's desirable, but we need to think about the instruments that have been overlooked or being seen as in the too politically difficult boxes, such as an additional fiscal capacity or debt instruments. We all know that there's plenty of talk about having euro bonds or even euro safe assets. Somehow it seems to get left in the too difficult to complete box. And then last point on all of this, political will or even courage. Without political will or courage, we aren't going to make the transformations we need, and they in turn require leadership. And if you indulge me, I'll leave you with a quote from Montesquieu: "Useless laws weaken the necessary laws." And with that, Ernest, I hand back to you and look forward to hearing what our discussants have to say about all this. Thank you.
Dear Iain, thank you very much for setting the stage and for putting so openly on the table the key points of discussion and controversy of this important subject. Now, you addressed directly the ECB, and you stated that monetary policy and the ECB has been asked maybe too much over the past 10, 15 years. And what is the way out from the ECB's perspective? I'm sure that Isabel can help us there and give us an additional perspective. Isabel, over to you.
Let me first thank the organizers here from the webinar, in particular Ernest, for inviting me to be one of the discussants of this quite interesting report. Although maybe on the day-to-day, especially those who are in the policy debate, sometimes have a feeling that discussions on completing or achieving a genuine economic and monetary union go very slow or reach a stalemate. I mean, it is a very important discussion where we need to always keep the momentum going and need to continue to find ways to achieve this, and in particular because, as Iain has mentioned in his conclusion of his report, well, although much has been achieved, there remains flaws and challenges. And of course, I mean, let's say over the past decades, with some of these flaws we have managed to live, but I mean, there are costs associated to these flaws. And of course, one is that central bank was maybe more often than desired called to step in more than it wanted to step in. And of course, we also see that such flaws, if certain shocks occur, could have high costs again associated with them. I mean, we can maybe expect, as Europe has often been forced into crisis, that European policymakers will at those points make the necessary steps and reforms that would be needed to continue to ensure that EMU functions and functions well. But as Iain mentioned, it's better to do this in times when the weather is good, so that you ensure that you have the good design. But at least what we can do is discuss during the good times what could be done when the political momentum is also there to move forward. In my short 10 minutes, I wanted to focus a little bit on the reflections on the fiscal framework. And the reasons are basically twofold. On the one hand, we have had during the pandemic and during the energy crisis, now the fiscal rules, as you'd say, quote unquote, suspended. The general escape clause was activated. And so at the end of the year, this period is over. We need to return to the fiscal rules. But I think already before the pandemic, there was a consensus that the old rules were no longer adequate and they had some flaws. And this sense has only become stronger following the developments in the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And the second reason is, of course, that the Commission has tabled a proposal that was part of the governance review that was in any case due, so that's not necessarily raised to the pandemic. And of course, that turns the spotlight on the EU fiscal rules again and more momentum in this area. But I'm going to argue a little bit that for me, not only the spotlight should be on the EU fiscal rules, but also on the central fiscal capacity, which has not been touched upon so much in the governance review, and I consider an important part of how to go forward in the fiscal framework. Just taking a step back on the current fiscal framework, current fiscal rules, I'm not going to bore you by going line by line of what worked and what didn't work. You can see the lines of what didn't work so well is unfortunately a bit longer as what has worked. And of course, there were a variety of reasons, from too complex to, the sticks don't work, maybe we need more carrots, insufficient ownership. But I just want to zoom in a little bit on the fact that the fiscal framework has also not evolved with a changing economic reality. I mean, Iain has also alluded to that in his presentation. And of course, the first important factor, and that was already the case before the pandemic, was that we've seen the interest growth differential gradually moving lower. And here this chart shows this for advanced economies. I'm looking even over a very long history. But of course, you can see in the years that the EMU was forged, the interest growth differential and where we thought R-G would be for the period thereafter was very different than where it is now. And of course, that has important implications when we talk about debt. So, when the 60% debt target, let's say, quote unquote, was written down, that was a very different economic environment than we are in today. And so, having a much lower R-G allows you to, of course, run much higher debt levels without considering these problematic. And actually, we've seen an increase in debt ratios across jurisdictions. So here, just showing the G7, of course, got nicely data back to 1875 on that. But you can see we're standing at historically high debt levels. I mean, this ratio was only reached in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War I. So, we really have very high debt levels, but at the same time, by and large, this works because, of course, we have this low interest growth differential. Now, some would argue it's a policy race moving away from the zero lower bound, that maybe these arguments become less valid, but, if you twist and turn things, many factors that cause the R star at least to be low are still here with us. So at least R is very likely to stay below zero for some time to come, which would make high debt levels less concerning. And that would mean basically this 120 rule combined with the 60% debt target that we have in the old fiscal rules does not make sense. Another factor that we have that has become a recent challenge is that climate transition, but also the war and the related strive for open strategic autonomy are requiring more importance of public goods, right? So either in the defense we may think of, or we may think on the climate and climate public goods. And that, of course, requires more role of the public sector and more public investment, right? And of course, we're doing this in an environment where debt levels are already high. And at the same time, where in Europe we have debt divergences, but public goods, we would not necessarily, if everybody benefits from them across the monetary union, want to have them dependent on country-specific conditions. At the same time, of course, I may know a lot of plea that debt levels can be higher, but there's also some cases for some discipline. We are in a monetary union, right? And debt divergences are not a good thing in a monetary union. And also high debt levels in general increase the risk that we have certain changes in R-G. And the third factor I want to mention, and that's changing environment. I think we have moved from an environment where you have maybe the central bank put to an environment where maybe you have the government put. So the government has been very much stepping up its role during the pandemic and also in the war in terms of smoothing out the shock. But that, of course, leads to maybe a perception that this can continue to go on, that the government can smoothen out any shock. And of course, that puts at risk that there may be public overspending. So there's clearly a need when we return to the fiscal rules and for the future framework that these disciplining elements remain. So what are the implications of what I've just said for the EU fiscal framework? So the first question is, do we need new fiscal rules? So you may have already guessed from what I presented a bit until now that yes, old rules are no longer adequate, and the recent developments have further reinforced that. So we really need to rethink the fiscal framework. I very much liked the quote at the end by Iain on the Montesquieu, right? So we need to have rules that make sense and that are useful, and then they can be applied and will have traction. The second question is, of course, there's now a proposal on the table from the Commission. Is that the right way forward? Right? And here my answer is a mixture of yes and no. So yes, when you look at the conceptual part of it, right? Conceptually, the rules go a long way in terms of tackling or aiming to tackle some of the issues that have long been flagged before, basically on the fiscal side. But of course, the implementation of them in the practice looks difficult. I mean, one factor is, of course, that the rules are very complex. Yeah, so that's one, let's say, flaw of the old rules that has not been overcome so far. But of course, there seems to be also a lot of political difficulties to overcome. And I just pasted here an excerpt of the Council conclusions where Further clarifications and discussions are needed on the fiscal rules, and these are not minor aspects of the rules. So a lot of discussions is still needed. And I think a lot of effort will need to be done to make sure that we do move to new rules, that in the debates on the process and the workings of the new rules, we don't lose sight of the fact that the old rules were not adequate, and the new rules are indeed an improvement compared to the old rules. So I think that is one important factor. But this is my yes part. My no part comes next, and the question is a bit, are these proposals a leap that is going forward far enough? And here, I would say no. And the main reason is that there is no mention basically in the governance review of the importance of having a central fiscal capacity. And first of all, if you look at this new reality with this large upcoming investment needs, are the new rules able and really the adequate way to deal with this upcoming investment needs? It creates a lot of exceptions and a lot of difficulties to allow for such investment needs to be accommodated, and countries that are going to be fiscally more constrained because of high debt levels may be much more difficult position to accommodate these investment needs, which may think from a public good perspective are needed. So basically, these cases are prime cases to have a climate and energy security fund, for instance. And I'm just quoting this here because some staff in my department and some of the lawyers at the ECB have looked at to what extent this can be made possible under the current treaty. Some would argue the NGU design is only possible in times of crisis and can be only of temporary nature. But of course, when it comes to, for instance, the climate emergency, you have Article 192 of the treaty, which also say that actions can be taken to achieve the Union's environmental objectives. So one can see a scope, basically legally, to set up such a central fiscal capacity. And of course, here we can also draw on the NGU in terms of the positive incentives and in terms of having an EU common way of basically designing and setting up the spending and allocation of these funds. Now, I think in such a setup, we make the debate on the fiscal rules actually more easy and more clear, because we would have far less exceptions, and we may have somewhat tighter fiscal rules because the public good nature of, for instance, energy security needs would be met. And then finally, of course, central fiscal capacity, while offering the benefit for this kind of new investment needs, would also address a lot of the important elements to achieve a genuine EMU that we have always been discussed, because I really believe that the fiscal capacity comes before some of the other elements that one needs to have in EMU. For instance, capital markets union, a key element and building block there is having a safe asset. And of course, when you have this kind of permanency of the central fiscal capacity, then you create that kind of EU level safe asset. Another factor is, of course, for instance, EDIS, European Deposit Insurance. It would also help to avoid divergences across countries. And finally, as Iain mentioned, the internationalization of the euro. One reason why internationalization has stalled is more or less because the progress in moving forward and completing the EMU has also stalled. And an important aspect of an internationalization of a currency is, of course, having these domestic fundamentals of the currencies being stronger. For instance, having this kind of deep and liquid financial markets would be a very big help to have a more international currency. So this is more or less my discussion on the report. I liked it very much, and I think implicitly in what I have said, there's a lot of elements I think that I actually agree with what come out of the report. And with this, I hand the floor back to Ernest.
Thank you very much, Isabel, for these interesting additional and important perspectives. Now we turn over to our second discussant, Martin Larch, from the European Fiscal Board. Martin, Iain addressed the European Fiscal Boards and national fiscal councils explicitly. There is the idea of transforming the role of fiscal councils and of the European Fiscal Board from an observatory or commentary function towards an advisory or even stronger function. What's your take on this?
Well, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you, Ernest, for having me and for the opportunity to contribute to this panel of such distinguished experts. You now refer to this very specific question. That is a very pertinent one. I try to come to that in the course of my presentation. Well, before I start, the usual disclaimer applies. The views that I am presenting here are not necessarily those of the EFB or the European Commission. Now, first of all, I would like to congratulate Iain on a truly exceptional book. I think this is going to be a reference, at least for me, this is going to be a reference on economic and monetary union for years to come. And I strongly recommend this book to everyone who is interested in European affairs. So the reasons why I think that this is an excellent book are listed here on this first slide. And first of all, I think it offers really a very concise history of economic monetary union. That's not such an easy task. I've tried myself in the past, and I have to say that Iain has done a much better job. And this refers not just to the, let's say, the recent history that is covered, but also, let's say, the origins of the economic and monetary union. It also offers a very clear description of what the, let's say, the steady state is, what we actually want to achieve, the genuine economic and monetary union. So genuine is the adjective that Iain and others rightly uses. Then there is a very structured discussion. To me, that's the, let's say, the core of the book. It's built around the survey that Iain mentioned, 101 experts. And then it also offers at the end a very frank assessment of the way forward. And I think Iain has done a great job in his presentation just a couple of minutes ago in bringing together all these very nice elements that are contained in this comprehensive book. Now, when I read the book, I had this sense of a dichotomy. A dichotomy is a contrast between the normative part and the positive part. So how the EMU, the genuine EMU, should look like, and what we actually have. Now, this I believe this dichotomy is partly addressed in the book, especially at the end. But I think to some extent it remains unresolved because the book, and I say rightly, focuses on experts' view. And that's why I tried to brush up my understanding of the role of experts in the political process, and that's what I have come up with. This refers to what political scientists call the advocacy coalition framework, and it's sometimes referred to as the iron triangle. It's not, let's say, magic, it's very simple. And so the idea is that we have these three actors: legislators, interest groups, and public officials. And because the reality of the modern world, modern societies, is so complex, these three actors, they rely on experts' view. So the idea is that complexity requires recourse to expertise, and that's why all these three actors, they rely on these guys in the middle. Now, here, what I try to illustrate with these arrows is that in the current situation, and I stress now, in the current situation, my reading is that these experts have a strong impact on interest groups and public officials, and less on legislators, or at least less on legislators in some of the member states. Now, I'm making this point because I think that the gap between what we should have and what we have at the moment is a matter of politics. Now, that this is this is obvious and trivial, if you like, and I'm not saying that Iain in his books does not address this. On the contrary, he actually is fairly candid about the situation, also in terms of, and especially in terms of the origins of EMU. He says quite frankly at the beginning, and correctly, when he discusses the origin of EMU, that the introduction of the single currency and everything that was built around that was the product of largely product of political determination, and not so much the consequence of let's say of a rational conclusion that the conditions of an optimal currency area are satisfied. In fact, Iain stresses very much, or he quotes very prominent observers that at the time, economists or experts that were actually very, very skeptical. And nevertheless, thanks to this fantastic political leadership, the project was launched. Possibly, if you like, if you want to give a rational underpinning to this political determination, then it's probably this idea of dynamic optimal currency area. So the understanding that at the time, I think the majority of observers, economists, would have concluded that the conditions for that are not satisfied, but because participating member states, I mean, in the single currency, would lose an important policy instrument, they would have to step up efforts in another, so structural policy in another area, and therefore the conditions for an optimal currency area would materialize over time. Now, we know that these expectations have been met only partially, and therefore forgive me this sort of caricature that I put at the bottom of the slide, where the cart is before the horse. And in a way, I just wanted to use this caricature to possibly underscore a paradox that we are facing right now, in my view, namely that we had politicians who were forcing us into this, rightly so, into this endeavor, and experts, economists mostly, were rather skeptical. And now I have the sense that the situation is a bit inverted, where we have politicians, at least in some member states, that are being very cautious, while economists are actually still very much convinced of this project. And in fact, the book in chapter 8, I believe, includes a statement that is as disarming as it is fundamental. I've copied it here in red at the top of the slide, and the essence is, well, if we actually have such a broad consensus of where we should go, why don't we get there? And Iain actually provides three main answers. And I say up front, I have also transcribed them here on the slide. I say up front that I broadly agree with some nuances on this. So let me just go through them. Now, so he says there's a struggle, or that Europe leaders struggle about the sequencing. Now, it may have changed very recently, but I still remember a conference that I attended, actually in Vienna, organized by the Austrian Central Bank. This was before COVID. And the question came up, so it was about EMU and economic integration, and the question came up, we still have quite a few steps to take in order to achieve a genuine economic monetary union. So, and the political process can only cope with a certain amount of, let's say, priorities at any given moment in time. So what would be the absolute priority? And at the time, at least my perception was that it was clear at the time, I'm speaking of beginning of 2020, it was we need to complete the banking union. And I would tend to agree with that. Although I'm working in the fiscal area and I agree with the need to reform the rules, with the fiscal capacity, I personally believe that they're actually leaders probably have a good understanding of what an optimal sequencing is, but it's of course difficult to take the first step. Then Iain says there's a lack of trust that is frequently associated with moral hazard. He has mentioned it also in his presentation. This is true, and this is probably also one of the reasons why experts experts, you know, they make their point, and these are very valid points from a conceptual point of view. But in the political sphere, these points are not received, not in all quarters of the European Union. And then linked to this second point, there's the more fundamental explanation that Iain provide, namely that whether there are some doubts about what actually we want to go. I believe that this third point, and possibly also Iain, this third point is actually linked to the second point. And I mean, one could now provide a lot of evidence of why 2 and 3 are very important. I will only highlight very few. Now, the first one is the two graphs show the classical convergence graphs, where you have per capita GDP in a given year at the beginning of a period, and then average growth over a given period. So on the left side, you see 91 for per capita GDP, and then on the vertical axis, you have annual average growth. And this is sort of this broadly negative slope is what you expected from the convergence process, from the economic integration process. And then on the right-hand side, you suddenly have the invert picture, the same countries in a later period. So this just to say that the expectations of economic integration and monetary union may not have or have not materialized. In particular, when it comes to this issue of convergence, where underlying is the issue of structural policies, and also more fundamentally, I believe, the issue of are shocks across the EU random? Because if the shocks were random, then I think everyone would agree, even in politics, everyone would agree about the importance of central fiscal capacity. If these shocks are not random, then you get a problem and issues of moral hazard arise. Now, this is also why, at the very beginning, the Stability and Growth Pact was actually introduced. Iain makes the case, the point very nicely in his book. He also made it in the presentation. Now, when you look at this graph, it shows the debt to GDP ratio since the end of the 90s until today, including forecasts of 2024. You see that, broadly speaking, now if you accept some approximations, but for two groups of countries and over time, these rules have worked in the sense that debt ratios have acted as a buffer after a crisis, and then they came down, buffers were rebuilt, and then they went up again. But there is one important group of countries where these rules have not worked. And Iain in his presentation has also pointed the finger to some prominent cases where implementation of the rules was not perfect. And then at the end, you end up with then in a crisis, you end up with a temporary instrument, the RF, where you have a redistribution from let's say low debt countries to high debt countries. This graph is actually based on data that you find in the annex of the Commission legislation underpinning the RRF regulation. So this just to very quickly, and of course the story is much more complex, but just to illustrate, let's say, the predicament that we are facing. We all know where we actually want to go, but there has been, I repeat what I said before, there has been this paradoxical inversion of roles. Politicians pushed us bravely into this endeavor at the beginning of the 1990s, and experts were very skeptical, and now it's the other way around. Iain, and this is my last slide, Iain mentions also in the last part of his his book the importance of what he calls democratic legitimation. So there's a lack of democratic legitimation. I would frame this. I agree with him. I would frame this in a slightly different form, namely that we seem to be stuck in a vicious circle where governance is actually not helping in moving forward, because most important decisions actually require unanimity, and that's difficult to achieve in a European Union where the, let's say, the perception of how the single currency has worked diverge, and at the same time the performance across member states has been relatively sticky. So this is how I would actually frame the current predicament, and why we still see this gap between where you should be, I stress, including my own perception, where we should be and where we actually are. Now to the very specific question that Iain raised, and that also Ernest reiterated. I believe it falls under the heading of governance. I think there's a group of observers that would also include myself, that think that over time the role of the Commission has changed in the implementation of the Stability and Growth Pact, but of Economic and Monetary Union more generally, in the sense that initially the Commission was considered to be the guardian, and only the guardian, of the treaty, so the one that looks after the correct implementation of the treaty. Now, with growing economic and political integration, the Commission has inevitably, and I stress, there is no regret, or I fully understand, and I actually, so there is no criticism, it's inevitable, has become more like an executive, like a government, and a government that entertains strategic interactions with the Council and the Parliament. So those who take the final decisions when it comes to the implementation of the rules or then the adoption of new legislation. Now, there are some who say that one should separate again these roles, the one of the guardian of the treaty and the one of the government, the executive. And one possible way to do that in the very specific area of fiscal governance could indeed be to allocate more specific tasks to an independent assessor. Now, one can discuss what this extended role may be, but in order to make more, let's say, informed or draw informed conclusions on that, one would need to know where the reformed system of fiscal rules will go. So I think I leave it at that, but I agree with Iain that in any case, in the outline that we know of a reformed Stability and Growth Pact, there's certainly more space for independent fiscal assessment at the national and the European level than right now. So here I stop. I thank you for your patience, and again, congratulations, Iain, on this fantastic book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think we have now, at several instances, heard that politics play a big role in all of this. I think this is really the ideal time now for Jean-Pierre Vidal to come in and show us where the obstacles or where the perspectives, where the visions of politicians at the EU level are.
Thank you very much, Ernest, and thank you very much to SUERF Bocconi for inviting me to this webinar on a genuine economic and monetary union. And thank you also very much to Professor Begg for this rather comprehensive summary of more than a decade of debate on our economic and monetary union. Here I will speak in my personal capacity, but a personal capacity that is based actually on professional experience in several EU institutions. And actually, I was quite I must say, happy in a sense to see, I mean, many references in your book to the 4 presidents, 5 presidents report. I would not have expected at the time we were working on these documents that they would have such a legacy, in fact, in a sense, and I think that it also shows that there is a sense of direction in our undertaking and in our, let's say, our ambition and the ambition of Europeans to complete economic and monetary union. I think it's the right time to take stock of this debate, and actually for 2 opposite reasons. Well, on one hand, I mean, some argue that we are progressing to a genuine EMU at a very slow pace. There is insufficient progress, certainly on banking union, or too slow. Still significant work ahead on capital markets union. On the other hand, if you look at the recent decisions that have been taken by European leaders, you could argue that they give a very clear sense of direction to our European journey. And I just mentioned, I mean, let's say three decisions. So first, I mean, the decision to allow the Union to borrow to finance grants to member states, I think, is kind of a very bold decision and kind of, very unprecedented, and also, I mean, kind of unexpected. I mean, nobody would have bet on us, let's say in February or in March 2020. The second set of decisions relates to foreign policy, where leaders have taken major foreign policy decisions in the context of Russia's war of aggressions against Ukraine. And the third is that this rather lively, in fact, debate on European sovereignty or strategic autonomy. I mean, you can call it as you wish, but I mean, this is also a very important debate that relates actually to economic and monetary union, because the currency, I mean, the euro, is also an integral part of our sovereignty. Today, I would like just to make, 3 points, in fact. So first point. In any country, or actually federation, the fiscal structure is actually the outcome of historical forces. So forces that made the nation, and it includes geography, it includes wars, it includes crises. In this sense, I think the EU is no exception. And if you look at other federations, as actually you also do in your book, Professor Begg, and the typical example we take is the history of US fiscal federalism. And there, there are episodes. You refer to the Hamilton debt assumption episode. What was actually interesting in this episode is that the justification, in fact, for the assumption was that actually state debts were issued for common purposes, namely the war of independence. And that, I think, is interesting because, in fact, I know that the common purpose reason was also quite important in recent European decisions. So, for example, Next Generation EU was actually to tackle the economic and social consequences of COVID-19. That was actually a crisis that was affected all member states at the same time. Another example is the whatever it takes decision or moment of the ECB, where clearly the common goal or common purpose there really was to save the euro. And I should stress that, in a sense, it's also interesting because the legal debate on whether or not, for example, ECB decisions are in line with the treaties, in fact, bears some resemblance with the US constitutional debate you had at the time on the theory of implied fiscal power, implied powers, when Hamilton, in fact, promoted the creation of the Bank of the United States. So, there are many kind of resemblances on these two histories, but I think we should not also, overdo the comparison. But the point really is that we are in the hands of history, and I think this has also direct implication for the nature of our debate today, in a sense. So, which brings me to my second point, is that the fundamental question really is of a political nature. And I think this is why the debate on strategic autonomy I referred to earlier, is so important in this respect. We are all economists, I think, by and large, in these type of webinars, but we have to recognize, or at least that I do recognize, that the economic questions very often are subservient to the fundamental questions of a political nature. And the fundamental question really is, whether or not Europeans are willing or unwilling to continue their European journey. And that's something like the commitment to continue this journey has to be renewed, you know, and that's also that's why it's part of history. Unfortunately, I would say with Brexit, we already experienced the possibility of a no to this question, which raised the importance, in fact, of, you know, continuing this journey and working hard on the steps that we have to take and to do it smartly. Fortunately, I think that there are strong forces that makes us all, I mean, that makes all EU countries standing by each other. And during the several crises we have been through, I mean, this has been quite clear. And these forces, in fact, are those that create the condition for reaching the institutional changes that we have implemented in the past, and in particular in the aftermath of the global financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis. And for example, I mean, the creation of the banking union, that was extremely important because, in fact, it was a transfer of competence from the member states to the union level, with the creation of the single supervisory mechanism, or the decision, for instance, to create the European Stability Mechanism as a permanent fiscal backstop. And I would not, you know, have expected, I must say, I mean, in 2012, and then, I mean, I will be in a webinar with the Secretary General of this institution and former colleague Nicola. So more recently, another example is, of course, Next Generation EU that many of you have already mentioned. So in light of this, my third point is that by design, the objective of completing a genuine economic and monetary union, and that was very clear in your slide deck, Professor Begg, is actually aspirational. So we will never get there. And the reason why we will never get there is that we will only have to improve something that we already have. Actually, we have an economic and monetary union, and a monetary union that has already withstood, I mean, a couple of major crises, the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 crisis. So Europe has already demonstrated, and European politicians have demonstrated their ability to learn from crisis to crisis. And if you take as an example, I mean, the decision on Next Generation EU in the European Council, that resulted, I mean, from a sequence of European Council video conference convened by President Michel, 5 times actually, I mean, from March to July, 5 times from March to July 2020. And then the subsequent 4 days and night European Council meeting of July 2020. One of the key drivers, I mean, that emerged, I mean, in all this discussion was this full awareness, in fact, of the systemic nature of economic and monetary union, and therefore that we are there working for a common purpose. And that was, I mean, a very, very clear justification of this forceful response. So this time, I mean, nobody could argue that, in fact, the union reacted too little and too late. Of course, I mean, there were complex negotiation controversies, but I think that, you know, such controversies and discussion, hard debate, are actually germane to democracies. And I must say, if you look at the history of US fiscal federalism, for example, I mean, the debates at that time, at the time of Hamilton, were equally lively, if not more, in fact, in a sense. So let me just make one final remark. So today, as we speak, the Commission should adopt a proposal to review the EU's bank crisis management and deposit insurance framework. So, I mean, I don't know whether it has already been announced, or whether the conference, the press conference has taken place, but this is the plan. And this is a very important step in reinforcing the banking union. And this is a step, actually, that responds to a call by the finance minister, by the Eurogroup, but also by the Euro Summit, and so therefore the European leaders in June 2022. And this is also a first step paving the way for renewed discussion on other important files to finalize the banking union projects, and namely the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, which I noted came across in your survey, Professor Begg, as one of the most important potential innovation highlighted by respondents. Finally, and this will be my last point, I mean, we are supporters of Europe's and European integration. And I think that we should always refrain from excessive self-criticism and also to refrain from conveying the wrong impression that we are always doing things too little, too late, too slowly, in fact, in a sense. I think it's partly wrong, or sometimes, I mean, it's actually wrong. And too often, I think it's also give ammunition to forces that actually are working against us. So I think this exercise and what you have done in your book is actually a very, very positive contribution, because what it does is that we have to be fair to ourselves. We have to be realistic. At the same time, we have to be ambitious, so we have to continue implementing our plans. And I think it's extremely important because this is the attitude that we should all have if we want to take forward European integration and complete, in fact, economic and monetary union that is actually at the very center of it. And in any case, I mean, we will have to write our own history because it's a process of political integration that is quite unique and unprecedented, but and therefore, I mean, has to take time and mature at the appropriate speed. On these, I will give you back the floor, Ernest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre, for embedding our discussion into the broader political framework, and also for your update on latest legislative developments. We now turn to our last discussant, Nicola Giammarioli, for an ESM perspective. Nicola, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ernest, for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to share this panel with three colleagues and friends. We have been knowing together for many years, and we have been working together in many capacities. Also, it's a great pleasure to comment the book by Professor Begg. I found it extremely interesting because in a coherent way put together facts, analysis, and the result of the survey. I think is quite unique in this format, and I really would advise all the audience to buy and read it because it is really enlightening. I would like to start with a quote which is used many times. It's Schuman in the 50s said that Europe will not be made all at once. And this is the case also for the Economic and Monetary Union. It's a process started more than 20 years ago, but step by step we're moving ahead. And so let me focus first on what we have achieved so far. I think this is highlighted in the book, but I would really like to emphasize that in thinking about deepening EMU and completing EMU, we need to also cheer the achievement we have reached so far. And if I think at the lessons we learned during the Euro crisis, we got a lot of improvements in our framework. I mean, this is clearly mentioned in the book. The economic and fiscal framework and governance was really strengthened. If I think about the two-pack, the six-pack, the introduction of the European semester and the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, all these issues are now at review again, but we should really remember these were introduced first more than 10 years ago. Also, new institutions were created. I will mention in a moment my own institution, but it's not just the ESM. The ESRB was created, the three European surveillance agencies, also IC Martin, the European Fiscal Board was created. And of course, the EFSF first and the ESM later. We provided the 300 billion of support in loans to 5 countries, and this really safeguarded the very existence of the Eurozone. And let's say at the end of the Euro crisis, while we were thinking how to improve all the institutions has taken, I was personally involved in the discussion about the reform of the ESM. I will talk about it in a second. The pandemic erupted. And I think we should not forget the rapid and decisive intervention of all European institutions and the member states alike. In a matter of days, we put together a big package of 540 billion financed by the EIB, the Commission with SURE, and the ESM with the pandemic crisis support. And in a matter of weeks, the Next Generation EU was created, approved, and put forward. I think these are all signs of increased risk sharing within the EMU, and also a clear sign of solidarity. And if I go back to the quote by Schuman, he followed on saying, Europe will not be made all at once, step by step, based on solidarity. I think we have always witnessed this solidarity in what happened so far. Of course, now we are at a particular juncture where we are thinking about how to deepen the monetary union, how to improve it, how to make it genuine, as the title of the book says. And there are several initiatives that, to me, are very important. Actually, we should not forget that also membership have increased. When I joined the ESM, we were 17 members, then Latvia, Lithuania, Croatia now joined at the beginning of the year. Other members will join. So it's an evolving animal, it's not a static one. So going back to what needs to be done to really deepening a monetary union, I would like to focus on two aspects. I mean, the books has several areas where we should really make progress. Isabel, I think, rightly mentioned the economic governance review, the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact. For me, two key elements in the future are the completion of the banking union, and Jean-Pierre mentioned it in his intervention, but also let me focus a bit also on the central fiscal capacity. So first, on the banking union. A lot has been achieved, and one of the lessons of the Euro crisis was to launch the project of the banking union. The first pillar was achieved quite quickly, the single supervisory mechanism. Then the second pillar also was launched to some extent almost completely, the single resolution mechanism. What is missing, if I may, is the backstop, which would come with the ESM treaty ratification. This was already agreed and decided by all members. 19 out of 20 members have already ratified the new treaty. So we need just the last member to ratify the treaty in order to get the backstop operational. From a practical point of view, everything is ready. It's just a legal issue of the treaty ratification. And I think, as we have seen those days, we cannot take it for granted financial stability. Of course, the issues were not in Europe, but in other jurisdictions. But still, completing banking union, adding up what Jean-Pierre mentioned, the proposal of the Commission that should have come up today, plus EDIS, as mentioned by Isabel, I think is of a paramount importance. This would increase what I can label as a private risk sharing. So with a complete banking union, coupled with the capital market unions, we can really get closer to the US system, where private markets take on the shoulders a lot of risk sharing. And the more we have in the private risk sharing, the less is needed in the public risk sharing, which is also important. And I come to my second point, the central fiscal capacity. This is mentioned in Professor Begg's book, also the other colleagues touch upon it. I think we need to clarify what the fiscal capacity is about, because I believe there is a little bit of a mix of purposes. So talking about central fiscal capacity is a pot of money managed at a central level, being it the euro area or the EU, but then what to do with this fiscal capacity. And I think there are several objectives that are now a little bit mixed. One is the provision of support to national investment, especially for digital and green transition. This is what Next Generation is currently doing. Of course, this is a temporary mechanism. We need to see what would happen at the end. The second objective could be the provision of a genuine European public good, which is not yet there, but I think at political level, and Jean-Pierre outlined how important are decisions at political level, which are even beyond the economic sphere. It goes into defense and other issues. And the third point, this is what I would like to focus on as ESM, is the provision of central fiscal capacity for macroeconomic stabilization. So the euro area is hit by shocks, and we have seen many shocks in the past, including the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the energy shock, and other might come. And I think the central bank is more and more, and rightly so, focusing on monetary policy, tackling inflation. So these kind of shocks need to be tackled by the fiscal side of policies. And of course, the first line of defense is domestic fiscal policy. So the central fiscal capacity should not be an excuse for members not running prudent fiscal policies, bringing now down the debt level and creating fiscal space. But there could be conditions, and we have seen this in the past, where this is not enough. So I think to complete and deepening EMU, we need such a form of central fiscal capacity. Some colleagues at the ESM, a couple of economists from my department, they developed a proposal last year of creating a stability fund, which would be based on loans and not on grants. So we can avoid the discussion about the transfers, which is not politically viable in many members. We can avoid the moral hazard by clearly defining the condition under which this kind of central fiscal capacity is triggered. I don't want to go into the details. The paper is out, and also there has been other publication. And it's not important that ESM is providing this. What is clearly important for the monetary union as such is that also on the fiscal side, we move on with initiative at the central level. And of course, the initiative by the Commission of the recent past, SURE and Next Generation EU, could also represent a blueprint for what we can debate and discuss in the future. Just to conclude in a nutshell, I think in order to make the EMU more resilient and stronger, we need to increase both public and private risk sharing in parallel. So one initiative is not instead of another initiative. Both should move in parallel. And capital market union and banking union on one side, but also central fiscal capacity on the other side. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Nicola. You made many important points, but the last one was particularly impressive. I think that we need several parallel strategies to pursue in order to complete economic and monetary union. Now, I think given the time, the best way would be to just give a little time to Iain to comment. But before I invite you, Iain, I want to just select 3 points that were made through the chat, which you might in addition also take into account in your reaction. Now, the first point is changing the Treaty on European Union is difficult. Nobody wants to do this. There is therefore an incentive to disguise substantive fiscal governance changes as incremental in order to avoid the need of treaty changes. Now, as an example in this question, the NGU is given, which through Repower EU might have been already transformed into something more permanent. So this is the first question, what your view on this is from a political economy perspective, for instance. The second question from the chat is, what if R star, I mean, Isabel made that point, what if R star rose and the R smaller than G no longer holds or prevails? How would one then achieve the debt reduction under these more adverse scenarios? And the third point that I collected is Martin gave a very interesting slide on the advocacy coalition framework of politics. And there Martin made the point that there seems to be a broken link from researchers, from experts to politics. And there was also the question in one of the chat comments, do politicians not understand the subject matter? Now, I think if one carries this further, one can ask the question, does the link from economics to politics really just not work? Is it really broken? Or are there also simply among economists different possible interpretations and traditions and emphases on the best way forward and on the pros and cons, risks and opportunities of various ways forward? Now, with these additional challenging questions, in addition to the 4 very rich comments from the discussants, I leave it to you, Iain, to select points that you might find worth commenting on.
Thank you, Ernest. Let me just try to work through some of the points made then. I strongly agree with what Isabel is saying. You need to think in terms of carrots, not just sticks. And part of the difficulty with the whole disciplining approach to the fiscal framework has been that it lacked carrots other than those that were brought up inside individual countries. I also agree with her that it's necessary to work out the legal dimension of potential changes, and this ties in with the question you just posed about the legal treaty change. But there are two elements to this. One is, yes, it might be legally possible within the existing provisions, but if you stretch a treaty article, then you're trampling potentially on legitimacy. This, I think, connects to a point made emphatically by Jean-Pierre, which is when you get economists around the table like this, eventually somebody says, yes, but it's the politics that matters. Every generation of economists and every panel of economists seems to return to this question and eventually realizes there are political dimensions. Now, treaty change is at least a formal process, which will be legitimated if it happens. Doing it by stealth, which is the alternative, can create its own risks. And I don't think you need to be aware of the Bundesverfassungsgericht in Germany to know that doing it by stealth can lead to all kinds of backlashes. Now, Martin, you posed questions about experts and about the survey. Just one note on the survey is that I thought I might get 30 responses, so I was immensely gratified at the huge response rate I got, almost unprecedented to get nearly 90% response. I won't name check anybody around the table, but I do know that some people around the table were part of that response. So it's been immensely helpful. There is a risk of soliciting expert opinion, which is they can have groupthink, they can have ideas which are not radical enough to look outside. And this does relate to this advocacy coalition question, because if the advocates are stuck within the same approach to everything, then the radical solutions may be more difficult to bring out. That's something we must all be aware of. And I think those of us that have endured Brexit were told repeatedly during the Brexit debate that experts may have strong views about how bad Brexit will be, but we've had enough of experts, to quote one British politician. Let me make a plea as one. I think the rest of us around the table are also among that category, for listening to experts, because they do have very often useful things to contribute. Now, on the question of successors to Next Generation EU in particular, and also what Jean-Pierre was saying, what Nicola was saying about the potential new fiscal capacity, we have to think as well as the functions of the fiscal capacity, the scale of it. You can't stabilize with a fraction of a percentage point of GDP. You can affect it at the margins. But think back to the McDougall report that said you needed up to 7% GDP for true stabilization function within a monetary union. So the scale as well as the direction of this is some things to consider. I think another important point that was made by many of the discussants was to emphasize the resilience of the EU, of the Eurozone, and its capacity to deal with problems. Yes, we should applaud what's happened. We should say that there has been very explicit action in recent years. That action might have been unprecedented if you looked at it from the perspective of 20 years ago, when all these sorts of things would have been deemed impossible, be it the ESM, the banking union. Don't forget, banking union was something that was effectively stopped prior to the global financial crisis, even though there was an enabling clause in the treaty. Certainly the common supervision happened rapidly, so there is the capacity to act. I think the most extreme version of that is captured in Olli Rehn's book called Walking the High Wire, about the famous weekend in May 2010 when so much was decided and had to be before the Japanese markets opened. So there's much I think we can applaud about the way things have gone at European level. Now, I'm rushing through a bit, Ernest, because I'm trying to capture so many things at once. R minus G, well, yes, I do quite often read what Olivier Blanchard has written recently. I think inflation is going to fall rapidly. It may fall in a rather piecemeal fashion, and we might struggle a bit with food prices for a while. But if inflation falls rapidly, the need for higher R is not going to be there, and therefore the emphasis should be on the G, policies that promote G. And this is where public investment is maybe the underestimated part of the whole story. This is where Nicola is correct to say that We need to work out the functions of an EU fiscal capacity. Stabilization, yes, but the arithmetic problems. Public investment, yes, it can support what goes on in member states, but we should also recognize EU public goods. I think both Jean-Pierre and Isabel were saying much the same thing, that we can identify tasks that could be undertaken at European level more effectively than before. And for all of this, I simply draw your attention to a project I learned we were awarded just 3 days ago by the European Parliament to look into a more resilient EU budget. What struck me in writing the proposal for that was that we have fiscal frameworks, to some extent imposed top-down by the EU level or member state. What we've not really worked through is what the fiscal framework is at the European level, and it's been proliferating. The ESM is a new lending instrument. Next Generation EU is a new lending instrument, both outside the usual control of the multi-annual financial framework. A potential new facility for Ukraine is also likely to be outside the direct purview of the multi-annual financial framework. It's true they operate through the mechanism, but they're controlled in different ways. So we're facing new problems here about how to rethink EU finances, use the word advisedly, rather than the EU budget more narrowly as the MFF. And maybe that's Ernest, a potential topic for a further discussion. We hope to finish the work in September, so I'll let you know by then. I doubt I've covered everything you've all said, but I hope I've given at least some responses both to what came in the chat and the individual contributions.
I would like to express my greatest appreciation to Iain, Jean-Pierre, Isabel, Martin, and Nicola for sharing your rich insights with us. Iain, you can take along a big praise for your book, and I can really...
A hard copy of it from CUP at the weekend.
I can really encourage all participants to get a copy. It's really worth the read. Thanks to all of you for participating and for your questions also in the chat. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye and take care. Bye-bye.
Vielen Dank, Ernest.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.